Avinash Rathore believed intelligence could erase a human being without leaving a trace, while Chandrika Malhotra believed patience could turn disappearance into an art, and together they proved how terrifying a couple can become when love is replaced by control. Avinash Rathore and Chandrika Malhotra were the kind of couple people rarely questioned. They blended perfectly into their surroundings, changing cities the way others changed routines. Wherever they went, they appeared calm, educated, and focused on their own lives. They rented modest homes, paid rent on time, and never caused public trouble. Two outsiders. They looked like two independent adults who had simply chosen each other in a crowded world. Avinash presented himself as a freelance travel consultant who helped people find cheap routes, temporary jobs, and short stays. His work allowed him to speak to strangers daily without raising suspicion. Chandrika ran an online handicraft store that barely existed in reality. It was mostly a cover to justify constant courier visits, cash transactions, and long hours spent online. Together, their professions created the perfect excuse to interact with unknown people and disappear without explanation. They were careful about how they lived. They avoided deep friendships and never allowed neighbors to grow too familiar. Festivals were ignored, family gatherings were skipped, and social invitations were declined politely. Their phones were always locked, their laptops were encrypted. Every detail of their life followed strict rules, as if both were performing roles written long before they met. What drew them together was not love in the usual sense, it was control. Both carried an intense curiosity about the darker side of human behavior. They spent nights watching crime documentaries, reading about unsolved cases, and studying how criminals were caught. Over time, this interest turned into something deeper and more dangerous. They did not admire justice. They admired disappearance. Their conversations slowly shifted from curiosity to imagination, and from imagination to structure. They studied maps, transport routes, and areas where people passed through unnoticed. They paid close attention to places where jurisdiction overlapped and responsibility weakened. These were not random thoughts. They were rehearsals. Avinash believed intelligence was the greatest weapon. Chandrika believed patience was. Together, they created a system where emotion was removed entirely. Everything was calculated. They practiced new identities, memorized false histories, and learned how to appear harmless in every situation. Even their body language was controlled. No sudden movements, no raised voices, no public arguments. Their first step into crime was quiet. It did not involve violence or blood. It involved trust. They learned how easily strangers believed well-spoken people, how quickly desperation overpowered caution, how loneliness made people vulnerable. Avinash was especially skilled at identifying those cracks. Chandrika ensured nothing led back to them. Each successful manipulation made them bolder. The absence of consequences strengthened their confidence. Every time they packed their bags and moved again, it felt like proof that the world was blind. They were not hiding anymore. They were operating. Yet beneath the calm surface, something darker was forming. Their bond was not stable. It was competitive. Both wanted control, not just over victims, but over each other. Every shared success carried silent tension. Every plan was double-checked, not for safety, but for advantage. By the time they settled in their next town, the line between curiosity and cruelty had already vanished. What began as fascination had evolved into intent. They were no longer watching true crime stories. They were preparing to become one. And no one around them noticed a thing. The disappearances did not cause alarm at first because they never happened in one place. They were scattered across highways, small towns, and temporary work hubs where people arrived and left every day. Young men traveling alone were usually the ones who vanished. Most were in between jobs, moving cities, or responding to online offers that promised quick money or short-term work. When they failed to return home, families assumed delays, bad networks, or poor decisions. Avinash was the one who selected them. He studied online forums, travel groups, and job boards where people openly shared their struggles. He looked for profiles with few friends, limited family mentions, and recent posts suggesting urgency. Chandrika verified everything quietly, checking timelines, locations, and digital activity. If someone had strong ties or frequent check-ins, they were ignored. The system allowed no risk. Contact was always initiated casually. A travel suggestion here, a work lead there, nothing that felt urgent or forceful. The conversations were designed to feel helpful, almost forgettable. Once trust was established, plans were moved offline. Burner phones replaced real numbers. Meeting points were always temporary spaces such as bus stops, roadside cafes, or shared accommodations, booked under false names. Once a person entered their control, the outside world faded quickly. Phones were taken under excuses of poor signal or charging needs. Documents were collected for verification. Movement became limited without the victim fully realizing it. The couple relied more on psychological pressure than physical force. Confusion, exhaustion, and isolation did most of the work. Afterward, there was no trace. No social media updates. No bank activity. No digital footprint. Avinash ensured that accounts were quietly deactivated, while Chandrika handled the disposal of personal belongings. Items that could identify someone were destroyed. Others were kept. These were not trophies in the traditional sense. They were reminders of efficiency. Police reports were filed weeks later, sometimes months. By then, locations had changed. Jurisdictions clashed. Details were inconsistent. Investigators treated the cases as individual disappearances rather than connected crimes. Some officers suspected voluntary runaways. Others believed the missing men had crossed borders illegally. Without bodies or witnesses, there was little to pursue. Avinash and Chandrika watched these developments closely. News reports were tracked. Police statements were analyzed. Each mistake by authorities reinforced their confidence. They refined their methods, adjusting timelines and locations. They began to stagger incidents to avoid patterns. Different states, different routes, different cover stories. But repetition created carelessness. What had once been carefully spaced started happening more often. The need for control grew stronger. Chandrika began documenting their movements in coded form, noting emotions, reactions, and outcomes. These records were not meant for memory. They were meant for reflection. Avinash, on the other hand, focused on expansion. He explored new regions and riskier environments. He believed complexity would hide them better. Crowded areas, mixed populations, and constant movement gave him a false sense of security. The first sign of danger came from an unexpected place. A man they targeted grew suspicious early. Small inconsistencies bothered him. He noticed the constant phone switching, the lack of fixed addresses, the way questions were avoided. He did not confront them, but he stayed alert. During a brief roadside stop, he ran. The escape was messy, rushed, and unplanned. The man reached a nearby shop and contacted authorities. His account was fragmented but alarming. He described being controlled, isolated, and moved against his will by a couple traveling together. For the first time, investigators had a living witness. What had been scattered disappearances suddenly pointed in one direction. The pattern was no longer invisible. And somewhere on the road, Avinash and Chandrika realized that the world was beginning to see them. The escape changed everything. What had once felt controlled and predictable suddenly became unstable. Avinash reacted by tightening his methods, while Chandrika grew quieter and more observant. The careful rhythm they had maintained for months was broken, replaced by urgency and pressure. Every movement now felt watched, every sound suspicious. Still, instead of stopping, they pushed forward. Their behavior shifted in subtle but dangerous ways. Avinash became more aggressive in planning, shortening preparation time and taking chances he would have avoided before. He believed speed would protect them, that acting before authorities could connect evidence was the smartest move. Chandrika noticed the flaws immediately. Rushed decisions created mistakes, and mistakes left traces. Despite her concerns, the operations continued. The couple moved closer to populated areas, choosing places where crowds created anonymity. They believed noise and chaos would bury their actions. What they failed to realize was that crowds also created witnesses. Security cameras were everywhere, even when unnoticed. Digital shadows followed every booking, every vehicle, every transaction. Chandrika began keeping detailed records, but not in obvious ways. She used symbols, dates, and fragmented notes written across different notebooks. These writings focused less on logistics and more on control. They revealed an unsettling truth. Power mattered more to her than partnership. She studied Avinash as closely as she studied their targets, noting changes in his behavior, his confidence, and his growing recklessness. Avinash, meanwhile, felt invincible. He saw the escape as a minor failure rather than a warning. The absence of immediate consequences convinced him that authorities were still far behind. This belief fueled his ego. He expanded their activities, increasing frequency and narrowing recovery time between movements. The more risks he took, the more dominant he became within the partnership. The crimes themselves also changed. What began as manipulation and disappearance took on a darker edge. Control was no longer enough. There was a growing desire to test limits, to see how far they could go without being caught. This escalation was not driven by need or survival. It was driven by satisfaction. Evidence of this shift later shocked investigators. Items recovered from abandoned locations showed deliberate organization. Belongings were sorted, labeled, and preserved. Some were sealed away, untouched. Others, were altered beyond recognition. The contrast suggested internal conflict, as if one person wanted to erase the past while the other wanted to remember it. Their relationship deteriorated quietly. There were no public signs, no visible conflict. The tension existed beneath the surface, hidden behind routine. Trust eroded. Each began guarding information from the other. Chandrika duplicated records and stored them separately. Avinash changed plans without explanation. Both prepared for betrayal without openly acknowledging it. The pressure intensified as reports surfaced, linking multiple disappearances. Authorities began sharing data across states. Composite descriptions emerged. A vehicle type appeared more than once. Travel patterns overlapped, though names were still unknown. The outline of a couple operating together became clear. Chandrika sensed a shift before Avinash did. She monitored news carefully, noting the change in tone. Investigators were no longer dismissing cases as runaways. The language had hardened. Resources increased. The hunt was becoming organized. Instead of warning Avinash, she adjusted her own strategy. She began collecting material that could protect her if everything collapsed. Digital copies, physical notes, fragments of proof. Her focus was no longer survival together, but survival alone. By the time Avinash realized how close authorities were, it was too late to return to the old methods. The system they built was cracking from inside and outside at the same time. The partnership that once felt unstoppable was now unstable. Driven by fear, ego, and silent preparation for an ending neither of them planned to share. The investigation moved faster than either of them expected. What had once been isolated, reports were now part of a coordinated effort. Data from different states was pulled together, timelines were aligned, and similarities that once seemed coincidental became undeniable. A couple traveling together, frequently changing locations, using temporary identities, and leaving behind no clear trail was no longer a theory. It was the center of the case. The farmhouse outside Nagpur became the turning point. It was not discovered through chance, but through patience. Investigators tracked overlapping rental records, utility usage, and vehicle sightings that pointed to the same rural property. The location stood out because it was remote enough to avoid attention but close enough to highways for quick movement. When authorities arrived, the place was empty. Inside, the silence felt heavy. Rooms were bare, almost clinical. There were no personal decorations, no signs of long-term living. That absence itself raised suspicion. Forensic teams began a careful search, uncovering details that told a disturbing story. Beneath floorboards and inside sealed containers, they found destroyed electronics, altered identification cards, and clothing belonging to multiple individuals. Each item suggested intent, planning, and repetition. In a locked storage area, investigators discovered handwritten materials wrapped in plastic. These writings were fragmented but detailed, filled with symbols, dates, and emotional observations. Experts spent days decoding them. What emerged was a timeline of movements, locations, and outcomes. The notes did not describe crimes directly, but they documented control, anticipation, and satisfaction. They revealed a mindset that treated human lives as variables. There were signs of hurried departure. Burn marks in the backyard indicate last-minute destruction. Fresh tire tracks suggested they had left only days earlier. Neighbors reported seeing a vehicle leaving late at night, but no one could provide a clear description. By the time the farmhouse was secured, Avinash and Chandrika were already on the move again. The discovery triggered national attention. Media coverage intensified, and the case shifted from missing persons to a multi-state crime investigation. Composite sketches were released. Travel records were flagged. Border authorities were alerted. For the first time, the couple's anonymity began to collapse. Chandrika separated first. She understood that moving together made them visible. Using forged documents, she boarded a long-distance train, changing routes multiple times. Her plan was to vanish completely, leaving behind enough confusion to delay capture. She believed she could rewrite herself once more. Avinash chose a different path. He stayed mobile, moving through smaller towns near border regions. He relied on speed and isolation, convinced that familiarity with escape tactics would protect him. He underestimated how much the investigation had evolved. Chandrika was arrested at a routine verification checkpoint. The documents she carried were convincing but imperfect. A minor inconsistency triggered further questioning. Within hours, her identity unraveled. When authorities searched her belongings, they found digital storage devices containing fragments of the coded records. The evidence was incomplete, but it was enough. Avinash was captured days later in a remote town after being recognized by a transport worker who had seen his image in the news. He did not resist. By then, the sense of control he once relied on was gone. Neither expressed shock, Their calm demeanor disturbed investigators more than anger would have. The case files expanded rapidly as evidence from the farmhouse, digital devices, and survivor testimony came together. What remained unresolved was the fate of many victims. Without Bodhi's closure was impossible. Families were left with questions that might never be answered. The farmhouse stood empty again, sealed and silent, holding the weight of what had finally been uncovered in the darkness that had almost escaped. The final stage of the case revealed a truth more disturbing than the crimes themselves. As investigators pieced together evidence from devices, journals, travelogues, and survivor testimony, it became clear that Avinash Rathore and Chandrika Malhotra had never shared the same end goal. Their partnership, once believed to be built on loyalty and shared intent, was fragile from the beginning. What looked like unity was in reality a temporary alliance driven by individual ambition. Forensic experts discovered that Chandrika's records were not merely reflections or personal notes. Many entries were structured in a way that preserved timelines, locations, and behavioral patterns. These were not memories. They were safeguards. She had been documenting everything in anticipation of betrayal. Digital files recovered from encrypted storage showed backups of the same coded material, stored across multiple devices and accounts. She had prepared exits long before the investigation closed in. Avinash's data told a different story. His digital footprint revealed searches related to identity erasure, untraceable travel routes, and methods of eliminating liabilities. Investigators concluded that he had planned to disappear alone. Chandrika, in his plan, was never meant to survive the collapse. The same control he exercised over victims was slowly being directed toward her. This revelation shocked even seasoned officers. The couple that terrified the nation had never trusted each other. Every shared success carried a hidden countdown. Every move forward also prepared an ending. During legal proceedings, neither showed remorse. Psychological evaluations described both as highly calculating, emotionally detached, and motivated by dominance rather than emotion. Their calmness in custody unsettled observers. There were no dramatic breakdowns, no visible regret, only silence and control. The survivor's testimony became the emotional center of the trial. His account confirmed patterns found in evidence and validated connections between cases spread across states. Though many victims were never recovered, the consistency of details convinced the court of the scale and intent behind the crimes. Both were convicted on multiple counts, including abduction, murder, identity fraud, and organized criminal conspiracy. Life imprisonment was handed down, ensuring they would never return to society. Appeals were filed and rejected. The legal chapter closed, but the human cost remained open. Families of the missing were left with uncertainty rather than answers. Without remains, there were no funerals, no final goodbyes. Many continued searching, holding on to fragments of hope even after verdicts were delivered. The case exposed deep flaws in systems that failed to connect early warnings and allowed creditors to operate unnoticed for so long. In the years that followed, the case was studied in criminal psychology programs and law enforcement training. It became a cautionary example of how intelligence, patience, and emotional emptiness could combine into something deeply dangerous. It also highlighted how partnerships based on control are destined to collapse inward. Avinash and Chandrika were separated permanently, housed in different high-security facilities. Communication between them was forbidden. The bond that once fueled their crimes was erased by the very paranoia that created it. Their story ended not with mystery, but with exposure, not with loyalty, but with betrayal, and not with escape, but with the realization that even the most carefully constructed darkness eventually leaves a trace.